The story of ancient Greece. In ancient times, Greece was not a united country. It was a collection of separate lands where Greek-speaking people lived. By 3000 BCE, the Minoans lived on the large Greek island of Crete. The Minoans created an elegant civilization that had great power in the Mediterranean world. The Minoans were sea traders who traveled to Egypt and Mesopotamia. Through trade, they learned new ideas and technology. The Minoans adapted these new ideas to their own culture. The Mycenaeans conquered Crete around 1400 BCE and built a new civilization. The Mycenaeans were also sea traders. They traded with Sicily, Italy, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. The Mycenaeans learned many new skills, including writing, from the Minoans. They also learned from the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians. They passed on these influences to the later Greeks. The Mycenaeans are best remembered for the Trojan War, which took place around 1250 BCE. In the war, the Mycenaeans defeated the city of Troy. Greek legend attributes the war to a conflict stemming from the Trojan prince Paris capturing Helen, the beautiful wife of a Greek king. The Mycenaeans sailed to Troy to rescue her. For the next 10 years, the two sides battled until the Greeks finally had seized Troy and burned the city to the ground. A polis is made up of a city and its surrounding countryside, which includes numerous villages. Most city-states controlled between 50 and 500 square miles of territory. They were often home to fewer than 10,000 residents. At the agora or the marketplace, or on a fortified hilltop called an acropolis, citizens often gather to discuss city government. The Trojan War is famous in part because it is a story written by a famous Greek writer named Homer. A version of the famous Trojan horse has been rewritten many times over into movies, sitcoms, and other pop entertainment. Watch one version of the story linked on Schoology called The Trojan Horse. Located in the southern part of Greece, known as Peloponnesus, Sparta was nearly cut off from the rest of Greece by the Gulf of Corinth. In outlook and value, Sparta contrasted sharply with the other city-states, Athens in particular. Instead of a democracy, Sparta built a military state. Around 725 BCE, Sparta conquered the neighboring region of Messenia and took over the land. The Spartans made the Messenians their slaves, or helots, peasants who were forced to stay on the land they worked. In about 650 BCE, the Messenians revolted. The Spartans, who were outnumbered 8 to 1, just barely put down the revolt. It took 30 years. Shocked by their vulnerability, they dedicated themselves to making Sparta a very strong city-state. Spartan men strove to be first-rate soldiers, and women strove to be the mothers of soldiers. Spartans despised the other Greeks who lived behind city walls, believing that a city defended by Spartan soldiers did not need walls. The Spartan government included 2 kings and a council of elders, 28 men over the age of 60 who advised the monarchs. An assembly made up of all citizens approved major decisions. Citizens were male, native-born Spartans over the age of 30. This assembly had only limited power to amend the proposals put before it. Mostly, it was expected to approve the council's plans. Rejections were rare because the council retained the right to withdraw any proposal that they thought the assembly might give a negative vote to. The Spartans isolated themselves from other Greeks. They looked down on trade and wealth, forbade their own citizens to travel, and had little use for new ideas or the arts. While other Greeks admired the Spartans' military skills, no other city-state imitated their rough way of life. Spartans were willing to die for their city, some suggested, because they have no reason to live. Officials examined newborns. If they looked sickly, they were left to die. At about age 7, they began training, reading, writing, and weapons. Around the age of 20, they became soldiers and were sent to frontier areas. Around 30, they were expected to marry, and around 60, if they were still alive, they were able to retire. As in many city-states, Athenian government evolved from a monarchy into an aristocracy, where only rich landowners controlled the government. Gradually, ordinary people wanted power as well. Merchants and soldiers argued that their service to Athens entitled them to more rights. Foreigners who produced goods and lived in Athens were upset because they were barred from becoming citizens, and farmers demanded change when times were hard and they were forced to sell their lands to the rich landowners. The first step toward democracy came when a nobleman named Draco took power. In 621 BCE, Draco developed a legal code based on the idea that all Athenians, rich and poor, were equal under the law. Draco's code dealt very harshly with criminals, making death the punishment for practically every crime. It also upheld the practices such as debt slavery, in which debtors worked as slaves to repay their debts. Minor offenses like stealing a cabbage were punishable by death. The term draconian comes from Draco. Draconian has come to describe something that is very cruel or severe, and is often used when describing drastic cuts. Solon came to power in 594 BCE. He stated that no citizen should own another citizen, and outlawed debt slavery and freed those who had already been sold into slavery for debt. He organized all Athenian citizens into four social classes according to wealth. Only members of the top three classes could hold political office. However, all citizens, regardless of class, could participate in the Athenian assembly. He opened high offices to more citizens, granted citizenship to some foreigners, and gave the Athenian assembly more say in important decisions. Solon also introduced the legal concept that any citizen could bring charges against wrongdoers. For Socrates seized power in 546 BCE. He helped farmers by giving them loans and lands taken from nobles. New building projects gave jobs to the poor. By giving poor citizens a greater voice, he further weakened the aristocracy. Cleisthenes, around 500 BCE, the Athenian leader, introduced further reforms. He broke up the power of nobility by organizing citizens into 10 groups based on where they lived rather than wealth. He also increased the power of the assembly by allowing all citizens to submit laws for debate and passage. Cleisthenes then created the Council of 500. This body proposed laws and counseled the assembly. Council members were chosen by lot or at random. The reform of Cleisthenes allowed Athenian citizens to participate in a limited democracy. However, citizenship was restricted to a relatively small number of Athenians. Only free adult male property owners born in Athens were considered citizens. Women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded from citizenship and had few rights. Greeks favored a lottery over a ballot, believing that all citizens were capable of holding public office. Elections, in their view, would unfairly favor the rich who had the advantage of fame and training in public speaking. Besides, all citizens were expected to take part in government. Only male citizens could participate in government, and citizenship was severely restricted. Tens of thousands of Athenians were slaves, without political rights or personal freedom. Although there were limitations in their democracy, they laid a foundation for our concept of a democratic government. Because Athens expected every citizen to hold public office at some time in his life, they required the education of male children. Girls rarely received an education. Boys entered school by age 7 and graduated at 18. Main textbooks were the Iliad and the Odyssey. They learned the epic by heart. They studied math, geometry, drawing, music, and gymnastics. Because all citizens were expected to debate issues in the assembly, public speaking, arguing, and rhetoric were also taught. Athenian girls did not attend school. Rather, they were educated at home by their mothers and other female members of the household. They learned about child rearing, cloth weaving, preparing meals, managing the household, and other skills that helped them to become good wives and mothers. Some women were able to take their education farther and learn to read and write. The Persians conquered a huge empire stretching from Asia Minor to the border of India. Their subjects included the Greek city-states of Ionia in Asia Minor. Though under Persian law these Ionian city-states were largely self-governing, still they resented their situation. In 499 BCE, Ionian Greeks rebelled against Persian rule. Athens sent ships to help them. Persia crushed the rebellion and vowed revenge. Darius the First, the king of the Persians at the time, was so angry that he had one of his servants whisper to him at every meal, "Master, remember the Athenians." Later, the Persians sent a huge force across the Aegean Sea to punish Athens for their interference. They landed at a city called Marathon. The Persians landed on a coastal plain called Marathon, about 20 miles north of Athens. They waited for the Athenians to send their troops down to fight them. The Athenians chose not to fight because they were outnumbered by 10,000 troops. Finally, after a couple days of waiting, the Persians decided to load up their ships and sail to Athens, where they would attack Athens directly. The Persians loaded up their cavalry first, the strongest part of their army. Then, while the Persian soldiers were waiting in the shallow water to board, the Athenians attacked. They took the Persians by surprise, and Persia lost 6,400 men compared to about 190 Greek soldiers. After their first victory, the Greeks sent the fastest runner, Peloponnese, to carry home the news. Though exhausted, he sprinted 26 miles to Athens. "Rejoice, we conquer." He gasped and then dropped dead. Today, we choose to run that same distance in marathons. On April 10th, 1896, 25 young men started running toward Athens from a marathon to recreate the 25-mile run. In 1908, it changed from 25 miles to 26 miles, and later the Boston Marathon changed to the 26.2-mile distance from its starting to its ending points. Salamis is a bay, not land, that is located near Athens. In 490, 10 years later, Darius' son Xerxes took over the throne and again wanted revenge. Athens had persuaded Sparta to join them against the Parisians. Parisians attacked from the north at Thermopylae. 300 Spartans held back the Persians temporarily before the Persians defeated them and marched south to burn the city of Athens. The city was empty, however. The Greeks had evacuated. The Greeks lured the Persian ships into a narrow bay called Salamis. In the narrow straits, the Persians couldn't form their lines, and the Greeks destroyed their entire navy. Xerxes watched from the shore in dismay. In the end, the Persians retreated for good. Stop this video now and watch the video for the movie 300. With the Persian threat ended, all Greek city-states felt a new sense of confidence and freedom. Athens in particular basked in the glory of the Persian defeat. During the 470s, Athens emerged as a leader of the Decolonian League, which had grown by some 200 city-states. Soon thereafter, Athens began to use its power to control the other League members. It moved the League headquarters to Athens and used military force against any members that challenged its authority. In time, these city-states became little more than provinces of a vast Athenian empire. The prestige of victory over the Persians and the wealth of the Athenian Empire set the stage for a burst of creativity in Athens. The city was entering its brief golden age. For close to 50 years, from 477 to 431 BCE, Athens experienced a growth in intellectual and artistic learning. This period was often called the Golden Age of Athens. During this Golden Age, drama, sculpture, poetry, philosophy, architecture, and science all reached new heights. The artistic and literacy legacies of the time continue to inspire and instruct people around the world. The Golden Age of Greece, sometimes called the Age of Pericles. Pericles was a wise and popular statesman who led Athens during much of its Golden Age. Pericles held on to popular support for 32 years. He was a skillful politician, an inspiring speaker, and a respected general. He had three goals for Greece: to strengthen the Athenian democracy, to hold and strengthen the empire, and to glorify Athens. Periclean Athens was a direct democracy. Under this system, a large number of citizens take direct part in the day-to-day affairs of the government. By contrast, in most democratic countries today, citizens participate in the government indirectly through elected representatives. At least 6,000 members had to be present in order to decide important issues. Pericles believed that all male citizens, regardless of wealth or social status, should take part in the government. Athens therefore began to pay a stipend or fixed salary to men who held public office. This reform enabled poor men to serve in the government. Pericles' goal was to have the greatest Greek artists and architects create magnificent sculptures and buildings to glorify Athens. At the center of his plan was one of the architecture's noblest works, the Parthenon. The Parthenon was built to honor Athenia, the goddess of wisdom and the protector of Athens. It contained examples of Greek art and set standards for future generations of artists around the world. Within the temple stood a giant statue of Athena that was not only contained such precious materials as gold and ivory, but also stood over 3 feet tall. Greeks gave us 3 types of columns: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. You can see them in many of our famous buildings in the United States. The Greeks invented drama as an art form and built the first theater in the West. Theatrical productions in Athens were both an expression of civic pride and a tribute to the gods. As part of their civic duty, wealthy citizens had to pay for producing the plays. Actors used costumes, masks, and sets to dramatize stories. The plays were about leadership, justice, and the duties owed to the gods. They often included a chorus that danced, sang, and recited poetry. The Greeks wrote 2 kinds of drama, tragedy and comedy. A tragedy was a serious drama, most common themes such as love, hate, war, or betrayal. These dramas featured a main character or tragic hero. The hero usually was an important person and was often gifted with extraordinary abilities. A tragic flaw usually caused the hero's downfall. Often this flaw was excessive pride. Comedy, in contrast to the Greek tragedies, a comedic scene contained scenes filled with slapstick situations and crude humor. Playwrights often made fun of politics and respected people and ideas of the time. Although all 3 of these philosophers weren't around during Greek's golden age, Greek philosophy has stood the test of time and is considered a huge contribution to Western society. Socrates was an Athenian philosopher. He encouraged Greeks to question themselves and their moral character. Historians believe it was Socrates who once said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Socrates was admired by many who understood his ideas. However, others were puzzled by this man's viewpoints. In 399 BCE, when Socrates was about 70 years old, he was brought to trial for corrupting the youth of Athens and neglecting the city's gods. In his own defense, Socrates said that his teachings were good for Athens because they forced people to think about their values and actions. The jury disagreed and condemned him to death. He died by drinking hemlock, a slow-acting poison. Plato, a student of Socrates, was in his late 20s when his teacher died. Later, Plato wrote down the conversations of Socrates as a means of philosophical investigation. During the 370s BCE, Plato wrote his most famous work, The Republic. In it, he wrote about his vision for a perfect government and society. It was not a democracy. In his ideal society, all citizens would fall naturally into 3 groups: farmers and artisans, warriors, and the ruling class. The person with the greatest insight and intellect from the ruling class would be chosen the philosopher king. Plato's writings dominated philosophic thought in Europe for nearly 1500 years. His only rivals in importance were his teacher Socrates and his own student Aristotle. The philosopher Aristotle questioned the nature of the world and of human belief, thought, and knowledge. Aristotle came close to summarizing all the knowledge up to his time. He invented a method for arguing according to the rules of logic. He later applied his method to problems in the fields of psychology, physics, and biology. His works provided the basis of the scientific method used today. One of Aristotle's most famous pupils was Alexander, the son of King Philip II of Macedonia. Around 343 BCE, Aristotle accepted the king's invitation to tutor the 13-year-old prince. Alexander's status as student ended 3 years later when his father called him back to Macedonia. Athens had become a very big and very powerful city-state. Many Greeks outside of Athens often represented Athenian domination of the Delian League. The other city-states were resentful and mad. Pericles believed in democracy. He sent troops to other city-states to fight for democracy. Sparta is an oligarchy and sees Athens as a threat. So Sparta and other city-states form a union to try to bring down Athens. To counter the Delian League, Sparta and other enemies of Athens formed the Peloponnesian League. Sparta encouraged oligarchy in the cities of the Peloponnesian League, while Athens supported democracy among its allies. In 431 BCE, warfare broke out between Athens and Sparta. The Peloponnesian War soon engulfed all of Greece. The fighting would drag on for 27 years. Athens had lost its empire, power, and wealth. The Peloponnesian War ended Athenian domination of the Greek world. The Athenian economy eventually revived, and Athens remained the cultural center of Greece. However, its spirit and vitality declined in Athens, as elsewhere in the Greek world democratic government suffered. Corruption and selfish interests replaced older ideals such as service to the city-state. For the next century, fighting continued to disrupt the Greek world. Sparta itself soon suffered defeat at the hands of Thebes, another Greek city-state. As Greeks battled among themselves, a new power rose in Macedonia, a kingdom to the north. By 359 BCE, its ruler, King Philip II, stood ready to conquer the Greek fighting city-states. The Kingdom of Macedonia, located just north of Greece, had a rough terrain and a cold climate. The Macedonians were a hardy people who lived in mountain villages rather than city-states. Most Macedonian nobles thought of themselves as Greeks. The Greeks, however, looked down on the Macedonians as uncivilized foreigners who had no great philosophers, sculptors, or writers. For the most part, Greeks, particularly the Athenians, thought the people of Macedonia were backwards, half-civilized people. The Greek city-states were weakened by the Peloponnesian War and could not unite themselves or cooperate in fighting back Philip's army. They could not agree on anything, but finally, in 338 BCE, Athens and Thebes joined forces to fight Philip. By then, however, it was too late. The Macedonians defeated the Greeks. This defeat ended Greek independence. By 338 BCE, King Philip had conquered all of Greece except for Sparta. After his father's assassination, Alexander, with the help of his mother, immediately proclaimed himself King of Macedonia. Because of his great accomplishments over the next 13 years, he became known as Alexander the Great. Although Alexander was only 20 years old when he became king, he was well prepared to lead. Under Aristotle's teaching, Alexander had learned science, geography, and literature. He greatly appreciated science and the arts. Alexander especially enjoyed Homer's description of the heroic deeds performed by Achilles during the Trojan War. To inspire himself, he kept a copy of the Iliad under his pillow. As a young boy, Alexander learned to ride a horse, use weapons, and command troops. Once he became king, Alexander proved himself. When the people of Thebes rebelled, he destroyed the city. About 6,000 Thebians were killed. The survivors were sold into slavery. Frightened by his cruelty, the other Greek city-states quickly gave up any idea of a rebellion. After chasing and defeating Darius III and the Persians, Alexander continued to India. In India, in 326 BCE, Alexander and his army reached the Indus Valley. At the Hypsipethes River, a powerful Indian army blocked their path. After winning the battle, Alexander's soldiers marched some 200 miles further, but their morale was low. They had been fighting for 11 years and had marched more than 11,000 miles. They had endured both scorching deserts and drenching monsoon rains. The exhausted soldiers yearned to go home. Bitterly disappointed, Alexander agreed to turn them back. Alexander envisioned an empire that combined only the best of these cultures. He valued art and learning throughout the empire, as well as a strong military. He encouraged his soldiers to marry Persian women. He began wearing some Persian dress and jewelry. He even married a Persian woman himself. The idea of blending cultures wasn't a popular idea for some Greeks. They looked at the rest of the world as inferior to Greeks. The idea of mixing their cultures was deemed as a contamination of their blood and culture. So when Alexander died at 35, some speculated he had been poisoned. Officially, it went down as a fever. After his death, Alexander's vision of creating a hybrid Hellenistic culture came true, but only lasted a couple years. Art, science, and philosophy flourished during the Hellenistic age. The Hippocratic Oath is an oath historically taken by doctors today, requiring the doctors to swear to uphold specific ethical standards, in part to use their medical knowledge for healing and not harm. Alexander named more than 70 cities after himself and one after his horse. Alexandria, Egypt, however, became the cultural center of the world. It traded Greek marble, African ivory, Arabian spices. This city contained more than 1 million Greeks, Persians, and Hebrews. It was located on the sea lands between Europe and Asia. Its markets boasted a wide range of goods, from Greek marble to Arabian spices to African ivory. A Greek architect has drawn up plans for the city, which would have become home to almost 1 million people. The Library of Alexandria became a learning center. It had lecture halls, laboratories, and even a zoo. It contained thousands of scrolls from all over the world. Its collection of 500,000 papyrus scrolls included many of the masterpieces of ancient literature. As the first true research library in the world, it helped to promote the works of a gifted group of scholars. These scholars, greatly respected for their early works of classical literature and learning, they produced commentaries that explained these works. Among the city's marvelous sights was the Pharos, an enormous lighthouse that soared 440 feet into the air. Pharos Lighthouse was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Its light could be seen for over 150 miles. It was 600 feet tall, and fire created the light. Today, Alexandria still exists. It's the second largest city in Egypt with approximately 4.5 million people.